Story 1. The man next door. I used to live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays, waved to each other while pulling into their driveways, and held small block parties in the summer. Everyone seemed to know everyone, or at least, everyone knew enough about their neighbors to feel safe, except for the man who lived next door to me. His name was Robert. At least, that's what he told me the first time we met. He looked to be in his late 40s, tall, thin, with deep-set eyes that always seemed tired, or maybe guarded. He didn't talk much. When I moved in, I went over to introduce myself, holding a six-pack as a kind of peace offering. He answered the door after several minutes, peeking out as though he didn't want anyone to see inside. Hey, I said awkwardly. I'm the new neighbor. Just thought I'd say hi. He nodded once, eyes shifting from me to the street behind me. Finally, he muttered Robert. Then he took the beer, closed the door, and that was it. I laughed it off, telling myself some people are just private. But over time, his strangeness began to feel heavier, more noticeable. For one, he never seemed to leave his house during the day. At night, though, I would sometimes hear noises through the thin walls of our duplex, scraping, dragging, faint thuds. Once or twice I heard what sounded like muffled voices, though he lived alone. At least, I thought he did. I remember one night in particular, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone when I heard it. A sharp metallic bang followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze. My window was open, and through the night air I could hear faint grunting, like someone struggling with something. After maybe 10 minutes, silence. The next morning when I left for work, I noticed Robert's trash bins at the curb. They were stuffed full of black bags, all tied the same way, bulging unnaturally. Flies buzzed around them despite it being cool outside. I told myself it was probably nothing. I didn't want to be the kind of neighbor who imagines the worst. But once you start noticing little things, it's hard to stop. Like how he always kept his curtains closed, even during the day, or how the faint smell of bleach sometimes wafted from his open garage, or how stray cats in the neighborhood seemed to disappear whenever they wandered too close to his yard. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. He'd left his garage door half open, just enough for me to see inside. I pretended to be checking my car while I peeked in. What I saw made my stomach twist. The garage was nearly empty except for a long wooden workbench against the wall. On top of it were dozens of knives, saws, and other tools laid out neatly, almost obsessively. Next to them sat several plastic containers, stacked and labeled with dates. I couldn't see what was inside them. Just then, Robert appeared at the garage door, staring at me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes felt like they were drilling straight through me. Need something? He asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I stammered something about checking the oil in my car and hurried back inside my house. My hands were trembling as I locked the door. After that, he started acting differently toward me, more aware, watching me. If I left my blinds open, I'd sometimes see him standing at his window, staring. If I came home late at night, his porch light would flick on, like he was waiting. I tried telling myself I was overthinking, but one night erased all doubt. It was past midnight when I woke to a strange noise, a tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. At first I thought it was branches against my window, but then I realized it was coming from the shed wall. Someone was tapping slowly, steadily, on the other side. I held my breath, listening. The tapping stopped. Then, faintly, came a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, a man's voice. And it was right there, on the other side of my wall. I barely slept that night. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to know more. So while Robert was finally gone, for once I decided to check around his property. My hand shook as I slipped through the gap in the hedges dividing our yards. Behind his house, tucked out of sight, was a small shed. The door was locked with a heavy padlock, but what chilled me wasn't the lock. It was the smell, a thick, rotting stench that seeped out from the cracks around the door. I stumbled back, gagging, my eyes watering. That was all I needed to see. I called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything, the noises, the smell, the shed. At first, they seemed skeptical, but the smell convinced them to break the lock. I stood there, heart hammering, as the officers pulled open the door. What they found inside is something I will never forget. The shed was filled with cages, dozens of them, stacked on top of each other. Inside were bones. Some animal, some unknot. Jars lined the shelves, filled with cloudy liquid, and things floating inside I didn't want to identify. And in the corner, a stained mattress with straps nailed to the frame. The officers pulled me back, telling me I shouldn't see anymore, but I already had. Robert was arrested that night. I never found out the full details, what he'd done, or how long he'd been doing it. The news covered it briefly, calling him a disturbed local man, but I knew better. He wasn't just disturbed, he had been planning, preparing, maybe even waiting. Sometimes, when I think back to those nights, the tapping on the wall, the whisper I couldn't understand, I wonder if he had meant me to be next. Story 2. The basement apartment. I used to rent a small basement apartment in a 3-story house. The building had been split into separate units. Mine was below ground. A couple lived on the second floor, and on the top floor lived an older woman named Mrs. Avery. She was probably in her late 60s, quiet, polite, always dressed neatly in long skirts and sweaters no matter the weather. Whenever I saw her, she smiled, but it never reached her eyes. I thought she was just reserved, maybe even lonely. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The house was old, creaky, but comfortable enough. My basement unit was damp and sometimes smelled of mildew, but the rent was cheap. I didn't think too much of it. That is, until I started hearing noises from above. It always happened late at night, usually after midnight. Heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate, in the apartment above mine. Sometimes I'd hear faint dragging sounds, like furniture being moved. Once or twice, there was a muffled thud followed by silence. I assumed it was the couple upstairs. Except when I asked them about it casually one day, they looked confused. "We're heavy sleepers," the husband said, laughing. "We're out cold by 11. So if it wasn't them that left, only Mrs. Avery." I didn't want to accuse her of anything, but the sounds kept happening, growing stranger each time. One night, I woke to what sounded like humming, a woman's voice, soft and low, drifting through the vents. It was eerie, almost like a lullaby. Curiosity got the better of me. I started paying closer attention. Sometimes, when I left for work early in the morning, I'd notice Mrs. Avery's door cracked open, just slightly, like she'd been watching. Other times, I'd hear her moving around at odd hours, always at night, never during the day. Then, one night, I heard something I can never forget. I was lying in bed when a sharp knocking echoed through the vents. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. It was rhythmic, intentional. I froze, listening. After a long silence, came the humming again, this time louder, almost directly above me. I couldn't shake the feeling she was communicating with someone, or something. A week later, I was walking home when I noticed something strange. Mrs. Avery was outside, standing at the edge of the yard, staring into the woods across the street. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me when I passed, just stared, lips moving as if whispering to herself. That night, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob rattling. My heart leaped into my throat. Someone was trying to open my apartment door from the hallway. I sat frozen, listening as the knob shook gently, then harder, before stopping altogether. The next morning, I confronted the landlord, explaining what had happened. He looked uncomfortable, then sighed. "Look, you're not the first tenant to complain about her, but she pays on time, and technically she hasn't broken any rules." "What do you mean, not the first?" I asked. He hesitated before admitting, "People don't usually stay long in the basement. They say the same thing, noises at night, strange behavior. One guy swore she was sneaking into his unit while he was asleep, but there was never any proof." That didn't exactly ease my mind. The following weekend, things escalated. I came home late from work, exhausted, and as I unlocked my door, I noticed a folded piece of paper on the floor just inside. Someone had slipped it under my door. I picked it up, my stomach knotting as I read the message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Don't trust her, she comes at night." I felt the blood drain from my face. Who had written this? The couple upstairs, or was it Mrs. Avery herself, trying to play some twisted game? That night, I barely slept. I left all the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife in bed like an idiot. Around 2 a.m., I heard the humming again, closer than ever. It seemed to come from right outside my door. I crept to the peephole, trembling. At first I didn't see anything. The hallway was empty. But then slowly, Mrs. Avery's face moved into view. She was standing directly in front of my door, staring at it, humming softly. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. I stumbled back, hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. She stood there for what felt like forever, humming her strange lullaby. Then she leaned close to the door and whispered something I couldn't make out. Finally, she walked away, her footsteps fading up the stairs. The next morning I went to the couple upstairs. I was desperate for answers. They looked uneasy when I told them what had happened. "We didn't want to scare you," the wife said quietly, "but we've heard her too. Sometimes she talks to herself at night. Sometimes we hear more than one voice, but we've never seen anyone visit her." That was it for me. I decided I needed to move. But before I could, something happened that forced me out faster than I planned. It was my last weekend there. I was packing boxes when I realized I'd run out of tape. I decided to head out to the store. As I locked my door, I noticed Mrs. Avery's apartment door ajar. A faint smell drifted out, something sweet, but sour underneath, like spoiled fruit. I should have minded my business, but curiosity pulled me closer. I pushed the door open just a little more. Her apartment was dimly lit, curtains drawn tight. The air was heavy, thick, and in the middle of the living room was something that made my stomach drop. A circle of chairs, all facing inward. On each chair sat a mannequin, life-sized, dressed in old clothes, wigs on their heads. Their faces were painted crudely with red lipstick and dark eyeshadow. They looked like a group frozen in conversation, and standing among them was Mrs. Avery. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine, her mouth curling into the faintest smile. "You weren't invited," she whispered. I bolted down the stairs and out the door, heart racing. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away. I broke my lease the next day. The landlord didn't even argue. He refunded me part of my deposit without explanation, like he'd been expecting it. I don't know what Mrs. Avery was doing with those mannequins. I don't know why she wandered the halls at night, humming and whispering. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that lullaby in my head, soft and low, as if she's standing just outside my door again. Story 3. The apartment across the hall. A few years ago, I lived in a small apartment complex in the city. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was affordable and close to work. The walls were thin, the hallways smelled faintly of old carpet and cigarettes, and the elevator rattled every time it stopped. But for the most part, it was fine. My unit was on the 3rd floor. Directly across the hall lived a man named Victor. He was in his mid-30s, always dressed in the same grey hoodie and jeans. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. City living means you don't always get to know your neighbors. But over time, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. Victor never left during the day, ever. The only time I saw him leave his apartment was late at night, usually between midnight and 3 a.m. He'd walk down the hall carrying large duffel bags, his hood pulled low over his face. Sometimes he'd come back hours later. I'd hear noises from his apartment too, not normal noises like a TV or footsteps. These were different, faint drilling sounds. Hammering once, what sounded like a low moan, quickly muffled. One night I came home around 1 a.m. after staying late at work. As I walked down the hall, I noticed Victor's door was cracked open. A dim light spilled out. I should have kept walking, but curiosity made me glance inside. What I saw was strange. His living room was bare, no furniture, no decorations, nothing. Just a single chair in the middle of the room. And on the walls, dozens of photographs taped up in neat rows. From where I stood, I couldn't see what they were pictures of. Suddenly, Victor appeared in the doorway. His hood was down, and his face was pale, gaunt. He stared at me without blinking. "Do you need something?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't friendly either. I stammered something about being lost in thought and quickly retreated into my apartment. My hands shook as I locked the door. From then on, I was careful around him, but the uneasiness only grew. A week later, I was taking out the trash when I passed by the dumpsters behind the building. That's when I noticed one of Victor's duffel bags tossed carelessly to the side. The zipper was partly open. Against my better judgment, I nudged it with my foot. Inside, I saw clothes, but they weren't folded or neat. They were ripped, dirty, some of them stained dark. And mixed in were other items, a shoe, a broken phone, a purse strap. I felt sick. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he collected junk. Maybe he picked things out of the trash. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Later that night, I heard something outside my apartment door, a soft scraping sound, like something being slid along the floor. I crept to the peephole and looked out. Victor was standing directly in front of my door. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his eyes fixed on the peepholes if he knew I was watching. I stumbled back, heart racing, and didn't look again until several minutes later. By then, the hallway was empty. But when I opened my door cautiously, I saw a small object on the floor. It was a photograph. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my window. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building made me jump. Every shadow felt alive. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord. I explained everything, the noises, the bags, the photo. The landlord's expression darkened. "You should move out," he said quietly. Tonight, I was stunned. Wait, what? Why? What's going on with him? He wouldn't answer directly. He just shook his head and muttered, "You don't want to get involved. Just leave before it's too late." That was enough for me. I spent the rest of the day frantically packing. By nightfall, I had most of my belongings in boxes. A friend came with his truck to help me load up. As we carried the last box into the hall, Victor's door creaked open. He stepped out slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that chilled me to my core. "Moving out?" he asked. I forced a weak laugh. "Yeah, just time for a change." He nodded, still smiling. "That's too bad. I was just about to invite you over." I muttered something about being busy and hurried down the stairs with my friend. We didn't stop until the truck was loaded and we were driving away. The next day, I called the landlord again, desperate for answers. This time, he told me a little more. Apparently, other tenants in the building had complained about Victor in the past. Strange noises, missing belongings, even rumors of people going missing in the neighborhood. But nothing had ever been proven. The police had questioned him once, but they didn't have evidence to arrest him. I never found out what was in those photographs on his wall. I never found out what he carried in those duffel bags at night. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that smile he gave me, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't moved out when I did. Story 4. The family next door. When I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11 years old, my family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. We weren't wealthy, but it was the kind of place where everyone kept their lawns neat, and kids rode bikes down the street without worry. Our next door neighbors were the Whitmans, a mum, a dad, and 2 children around my age. At first glance, they seemed perfectly normal. Mr. Whitman worked long hours and barely spoke. Mrs. Whitman was polite but distant. The kids, Emily and Josh, were quiet and pale, but I assumed they were just shy. For a while, I didn't think much of them, but then, I started noticing things. The Whitman kids never played outside, ever, while the rest of us rode bikes and played tag. Emily and Josh were always indoors. If I knocked on their door to ask if they wanted to hang out, Mrs. Whitman would smile tightly and say they were busy with schoolwork. At night though, I'd sometimes hear faint sounds through the walls. My bedroom was closest to theirs, whimpering, crying, sometimes a muffled voice, stern and commanding. My parents said I was imagining it, that houses creak and make noises, but I knew what I heard. One evening I was outside playing catch with a friend when I glanced toward the Whitman's house. Through the upstairs window I saw Emily staring out. She wasn't smiling, wasn't waving, just staring, her face pale, eyes wide. I waved anyway, but she didn't respond. Later that night, I awoke to a sound I'll never forget: screaming. A child's scream, high-pitched and desperate, cut off suddenly. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, but by the time they got up, the house next door was dark and silent. When my dad went outside to check, Mr. Whitman was standing on the porch. He gave a friendly wave and said everything was fine, that Josh had just had a nightmare. My parents accepted the explanation, but I didn't. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The crying at night grew louder, more frequent. Once I woke to a rhythmic banging sound, like fists pounding against a wall. Another time I heard what sounded like chains rattling. Then came the night I saw something that still haunts me. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by my window, staring out at the quiet street. That's when I noticed movement in the Whitman's backyard. Mr. Whitman was out there, digging a hole with a shovel under the dim glow of a porch light. The hole was deep up to his waist. Beside him was a large black bag. I froze, heart pounding, as I watched him struggle to push the bag into the hole. It was heavy, bulky, and it didn't move naturally. He buried it quickly, glancing over his shoulder several times before heading back inside. I told my parents what I'd seen. They scolded me for letting my imagination run wild. They said Mr. Whitman was probably gardening, but I knew better. I couldn't get the image of that bag out of my head. The next day I tried to talk to Emily at school. She avoided me at first, but finally, when no one else was around, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Don't come over to our house, ever." That was all she said before hurrying away. A week later, the Whitmans moved out. No warning, no goodbye. One day they were there. The next day their house was empty. The curtains were drawn, the furniture gone, and the family vanished without a trace. The house sat vacant for months before new owners moved in. Curiosity ate at me, so one afternoon I wandered into the backyard when no one was looking. I went straight to the spot where I'd seen Mr. Whitman digging. The grass there grew patchy, uneven, like the ground hadn't healed properly. I crouched down and pressed my hand against the earth. It felt softer than the rest of the yard, like the dirt had been disturbed. I never found out what was buried there. No one did. The new owners landscaped the backyard, covering the spot with fresh sod. Eventually, people forgot about the Whitmans, but I never forgot. Sometimes, when I think back to Emily's wide, frightened eyes staring at me from that window, I wonder what she was trying to tell me. And sometimes, late at night, I imagine what was inside that black bag and whether the Whitmans are still out there, hiding more secrets in someone else's neighborhood. Those were for scary, true horror stories of neighbors with dark secrets. Which story scared you the most? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true horror stories.